We interrupt this podcast for this brief public service announcement.
We interrupt this program for an important news announcement.
Hello, friends. We're coming at you from the land of the free and the home of the brave. Made in America matters, so we are asking all red-blooded, true blue, red, white, and blue Americans to support one of our favorite U.S. American manufacturing companies, Leupold Optics. Just ask yourself, have you America today? If not, consider purchasing some new state-of-the-art shades from America's Leupold Optics. Support American manufacturing with a new pair of 6 shades from LeupoldShop.com. And right now, when you use the code Brian2020, you get a free shirt of your choice from Leupold. Might I recommend one of my favorite shirts at Leupold? This glorious American Eagle shirt, because freedom. The American spirit shines brightest when our backs are against the wall. Through wars, natural disasters, and economic collapses, we've always shown a sense of grit and ingenuity when it's needed most. It's the same self-reliant spirit Fred Leupold had when he started his Oregon-based company 113 years ago. And it's what keeps the factory performing in Oregon today. Friends, support American manufacturing, because communism sucks. Made in America matters more than ever, so we're asking all red-blooded, true blue, red and white and blue.
Red and blue.
That's right.
All joking aside, folks, we over here at Gritty love working with Leupold Optics. If you're in the market for a new spotting scope or maybe some binoculars, please consider checking out Leupold Optics. Or, if you're looking for a new pair of sunglasses for the 2020 season, check out LeupoldShop.com and use the code Brian2020. Links are going to be in the description. Thanks, folks. Back to the show. So, I'm hearing this, and I'm hearing your explanation of what a hunter is and how a hunter should, or how hunters feel.
Mm-hmm.
But then you contrast that with the opening story with those guys going out and shooting bears.
Yep.
It makes me think of that quote from Luther Standing Bear, where a man's heart away from nature grows hard.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like those men in the beginning part have so grossly removed themselves from nature that their hearts have become hard and that they're able to go out and do those kinds of things? Does that make sense?
Yeah. You're assuming that their hearts were hard and that they were cruel.
Not necessarily cruel, but the I would say there was definitely some callous there, that they were able to go out and, because the one gentleman had no intentions of shooting a bear, or he didn't want to shoot the cub, I guess. And then he changed his mind. He's like, I guess I will shoot one. I feel like it was almost offhanded, his decision to go kill something.
I look at it like this, that you can't judge people in the past based on the knowledge that you have now.
That is a
very
true point.
It's not fair. It's not fair to your predecessors to judge them that way. You have to look at their culture then and what they knew then and where they were in life then. Because when you look at, for example, the culture at that time, you're talking, I don't know, 1940s, 50s time frame, something like that. You're looking at a world after World War II or around World War II, and the 50s and the 60s. You're looking at a hunting culture that's developing, right? And there is a sense that going out and being in nature, braving the wild, hunting a bear, all of that sort of this got some machismo behind it. It's a little macho. It's a little, and there's this conquering of the outdoors, right? And whether it's a male or a female isn't relevant at that time because they don't know what we know today about bears.
I mean, if they didn't have those two cubs, would they have been even able to guess that it was a sow?
No, you wouldn't really be able to tell whether it was a sow, or not.
I still can't judge a bear from distance. I mean, if it's not within 10 feet of me, I can't tell if it's a big bear or not.
You got to realize now we understand bear biology. And we know it takes a long time for a bear. It's got to be like 3 years old before it can get pregnant for the first time. Yep. There is a long time when a bear cub needs to be about 3 years old before it can breed for the first time, if I remember correctly. I think it's different for grizzly bears, worse. And it takes a few years for a bear to grow up, right? Those 3 years. So what you end up with is if a mama bear has cubs, then those cubs got to be 3 years old, 2 to 3 years old before they leave mom. Well, during that time where she's raising those, she can't get pregnant with another.
And there's a gestation period before that, before the cubs even show up, where she's not in the
True,
breeding.
but you're talking about a 4-year gap between when she gets pregnant to when she can get pregnant again. When you kill a white-tailed deer, there's another one that 6 months later that's born, that's ready to have a baby. The fecundity rate, the rate at which they can have babies is high. And so you shoot some and they'll just be back. Black bear are not the same. We know that when we shoot a sow with cubs, we have really dented the population. Where if you harvest boars only, you can kind of harvest a certain amount all the time, and that population will stay strong. But when you start killing a whole bunch of sows, you think about it, one sow eliminates, if she can only have cubs every 4 or 5 years, and you just killed 4 in a hunt, 4 sows and the cubs, you've lost generations of bears right off, like, fast.
In an afternoon.
Now, did they understand those things back then? Did they really know those things? Was that part of, did they even have game laws in some of these states? I remember when I was talking to our grandfather about this time frame.
They poo-pooed them, I'm sure.
And he's like, we just poached all the time.
Yep.
We just hunted deer because we needed food. When we ran out of food, there was a recession, we hunted deer and we gave it to friends and family, and anytime there was an opportunistic moment to shoot a deer. And then when the fish and game officers would show up at their house, they just didn't want their guns taken away. And they'd be like, hey, Joe, did you poach a deer? We heard there was a gunshot over. No, not me. I didn't do anything. And they're like, come on, Joe. And it was like a $50 fine if he got caught. He could still hunt and he still got his gun. It wasn't, they just kept ramping up the punishment because it just wasn't enough. But it was a cultural shift that needed to take place from, you can just do whatever you want, to, no, there's serious laws here, and it's disgusting to break them. So to judge these guys based on the way we are today, I don't know if that's really fair. They went out there and they shot a sow, they shot a cub, and the one gentleman didn't want to shoot one, but he wanted them. So he naively thought, well, let's just take him home as a pet. like
that is 100% what my wife would
do.
do.
That is a naive, ridiculously, childishly naive sentiment. Let's just catch it and then make it our pet. That just shows how out of touch they were as just with nature in general. But it shows this adventure that they're trying to have, and as they get in touch with it. But that first story is just some of many that were told in hunt magazines back in the day as told as a type of adventure that you could have. And some people are like, whoa, you shot some bears and then you tried to keep one as a pet and you petted a cub. And
well, with this, back to what we were talking about earlier, would you call those guys tourists or local natives that dwell and were part of the food chain constantly?
The whole point of that discussion was just to say these types of stories were told when I was a kid, and I read a lot of stories like this, controversial stories today, but not then. I think it's just there to say that there's a culture here that's been here a long time. And this story is somewhat controversial now, but wasn't back then. A lot of hunters didn't think twice about that whole story back then.
Is this just painting the picture of where we were and where we are now? Is that kind of what he's trying to do?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. It's to get you to think about it.
Well, he's definitely got me thinking about it.
To get you to be disturbed by it. But I think we have evolved in our ideas and our thinking toward wildlife and our understanding of conservation in a way that these people did not. They didn't have the wherewithal back then. Anyway, going back to the book, he says, when humans didn't need to hunt anymore, that hunting shifted from a necessity, from a way of life, to a sport, which I hate
the word
term sport applied to hunting. The reason for that is, the term sport when it came to hunting was to give it a sporting chance. That's what that meant. It had a cultural undertone. During Theodore Roosevelt's time, that was like respected. The idea sport lent it credence and value. And it also said, give the animal a sporting chance. It was another word for fair. Give the animal a fair chance. It was to make it a challenge for both. So when hunting became, so it wasn't a need or a way of life, it became an activity that human beings go and do, not out of necessity, but out of sport. When you say sport, I don't like the term sport.
I don't either.
I don't like it for a lot of reasons, because you're dealing with life and death. And when I go out and I hunt, the term sport simplifies it too much. It's too complicated. It's too complex to call it sport. It's not. Sport is me going and shooting hoops with a buddy. I'm talking about going out and connecting with nature. I'm talking about having a real sense of where my food comes from. I'm talking about understanding nature itself, how animals move. I'm figuring out how to survive in negative 10-degree conditions in the wilderness. And I'm going through a hardening process that I crave, a challenge that my human body somehow needs in order to feel fulfilled. All of these things you can't just say are sport. So I don't like that term. Nevertheless, if you look at it back in Theodore Roosevelt's time frame and you look at the word sport then, it lent what we did credence. It gave it respectability. And it went from being just killing primarily for market uses like buffalo, just killing mass numbers so you can sell parts of it, or beaver tails or hides or whatever. You go from just the killing thing to saying, you should only kill if it's fair, if you've given the animal fair opportunity to escape. And they've started to introduce an ethos into hunting that requires you to be giving animals a greater chance. And in a sense, what it does, though, is it says you as a hunter, the more that you can challenge yourself in the process, the more skilled you become, the more fulfilling the activity is to you. And so he's just getting into the point that it went from a necessity to a pastime. He said most hunting was based on subsistence or profits until this recent century. With the growth of cities and industry, however, the sporting impulse awoke. Right? What we just talked about. Promoted as a means of restoring virility and verve to urban men stuck in the doldrums of office, shop, or mill, and reflecting a new courage and curiosity about nature. American sporting hunting drew on diverse influences. The true sportsmanship ethos of the British hunt, the dead-eye heroics of frontiersmen Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, and the forest knowledge and stealth of the Native American. Literary heroes such as Natty Bumppo inspired it as well, as did eventually such mountain men as Jim Bridger and the legendary buffalo hunter William Buffalo Bill Cody, poet and philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, who took his first crack at a deer in the Adirondacks in 1858, termed the nation's new love of the invigorating outdoors the joyous change. So he's just saying that the sport of hunting, it evolved into existence once all of these other things were coming into place. He's just saying that, before, hunting was something that we did to survive, like the Native American Indians did, to the guy getting out of the office and reconnecting with nature so that he could feel what it was like to be at one with nature, like Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, Buffalo Bill Cody, and even Ralph Waldo Emerson, talking about these things in books and in literature. And so this idea of reconnecting with the outdoors became a message that permeated our culture at this time. One notable feature of the sport was its adherence to an evolving code of ethics that would eventually be known as fair chase. The idea that hunted animals must have a chance to evade or flee their pursuers, and that they were to be taken only under certain sporting rules and conditions. By the 1870s, the call of the gentlemanly hunt was something of a worldview, a faith endorsed by magazines, newspapers, and hundreds of new sportsmen's groups, and even preached from the national pulpits. Newly armed and outfitted Americans took to the woods. And that's, he said, by the 1870s. So you can see that Roosevelt grew up right in this time period, right as this thing started to take place. And what's fascinating, as he talks about this, is you can see all of these things happening during Theodore Roosevelt's time. Such editorial enthusiasm was matched by commerce, along with sporting clubs and shooting societies like the Boone and Crockett Club, Pope and Young, Abercrombie and Fitch, Remington, Smith and Wesson, and a bounty of sports-related items from heavy boots and jackets with deep pockets for shotgun shells to canoes, drinking flasks, and wooden duck decoys.
I get all of those except for the one where you said Abercrombie and Fitch.
Are you that young?
Yes. Abercrombie and Fitch for me is a hipster brand.
No, for years it was a Cabela's.
And then they went into shopping malls and started targeting young teens?
Yeah, they just changed their brand. Yeah.
Crazy.
When you watch old 1950s shows like, there's some with like Rock Hudson, and he worked. And there's one movie let's see.
That's crazy, because when I think of Abercrombie and Fitch, I think of like bad cologne and scantily clad mannequins.
Man's Favorite Sport with Rock Hudson. That came out, I believe it was, 1964. And he's in that movie, and he actually works for Abercrombie and Fitch.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and he's got his canoe and all his stuff, and he's heading to the lake, and he's in a fishing competition. And he sells the hell out of fishing gear and hunting gear through Abercrombie, but he's not actually he's never actually fished, so he sort of is a fake. And not sort of, he's a fake. So he's got to go and do this thing, but he actually doesn't know how to fish. It's this whole play on being a sportsman versus being a city guy. And even though he's a great salesman and all this, he's not a real sportsman. And so he doesn't know any idea how to use any of the gear that he sells. But he talks a great talk in the behind the sales counter. Oh yeah, this piece of kit, it's just unreal, blah, 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 blah. But he's never actually used it. So then he's got to go out and actually try to fish and camp, and he's horrible at it. And there's a chick there that drives him crazy. And it's kind of a romance, whatever. If you have not seen Man's Favorite Sport, you got to go watch it. Okay, 1964. You've got to see it, because it will give you a taste of this time frame that we're talking about, where you're kind of at this position where things are shifting from hunting being a way of life to hunting being a sport or a pastime with, a whole different feel to it. Okay. So
I'll go watch it. Fine.
Just like Field and Stream. It's just history, man. What's so funny too about that film is it's a little sexist. It's 1960s, like mid 60s, late 50s. It's Hollywood, man.
So my wife works at Sportsman's, and she works behind the gun counter. Mm-hmm. How would you describe Daisy in a nutshell? Tempered?
Tempered. No, that's the wrong word. Having a temper? Yes.
Yeah,
tempered? No. Tempered would mean like calm.
So she works behind the gun counter, and then all sorts of old guys go up, and she's the only girl.
I think in a nutshell, you could describe her as impatient
with everything and everyone,
but also like wickedly sarcastic.
But she also has a real soft spot for old men. So this is where the story's going. Mm-hmm. She works behind the gun counter, and she's the only girl there. And
this is your wife, for those who don't know.
Yeah. And old men always ask her, hey, little lady, could you hand me that gun right there? Mm-hmm. And they won't say the make or the model. They'll just point because they assume she doesn't know. And so she's like, she has decided to take it as a compliment that they're being, or they call her sweetheart. Mm-hmm. If some random dude was like, sweetheart, could you just hand me that thing right there? Outside of that context and would not being at work, she would light them up.
Yeah. Well, the movie's similar, like where he doesn't have a clue how to use any of the stuff, but the woman he's around works at the camp where he's at, and she knows all these things. So she's teaching him
how to do it,
how to do man's favorite sport. And really, it's a play on words, because man's favorite sport isn't fishing. It's getting chicks.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a classic if you haven't seen it. But the point is how things have changed. Okay. Mm-hmm. Abercrombie and Fitch, as an example, is one of those industries that's your Cabela's, your outfitter store back then. Also for sale were hunting excursions by rail or steamboat and the services of innkeepers, guides, and taxidermists. A robust literature of hunting stories, memoirs, and humorous tales appeared, accompanied by what would become known as the hook and bullet press, sports-related periodicals whose news and advice covered everything from fishing lures to the kinds of retrievers best suited for grouse hunting. Okay? So you have your hook and bullet. They still call it that today.
Hook and bullet?
Yeah, like Yeti has their soccer mom division at Yeti, and then they have their hook and bullet division, right? It's still alive today. Remarkably, even from the sport's earliest days in America, voices urged the need to respect and protect wildlife's seasons of procreation and cautioned against the decimation of hunted species. In the 1880s, organized efforts coalesced through sportsmen's clubs and the advocacy of influential periodicals, most notably Forest and Stream, that is now Field and Stream, to safeguard wildlife and natural places, from which grew a broader application of restraint and stewardship, the conservation movement, as well as the political will to place limits on hunting and create America's first wildlife preserves and national parks. Okay? And so he talks about this kind of in the 1880s. You started to have Forest and Stream, Field and Stream. You started to have the Boone and Crockett Club. You had the Audubon Society. You had these clubs forming, right? And then Theodore Roosevelt became part of these clubs, and he was active member of Boone and Crockett. And they would do studies and wildlife surveys and do all these things throughout the 1880s. Then he becomes governor of New York, and he starts implementing these through policy into the United States law. And then after he does that, he becomes president in 1901, and Theodore Roosevelt starts really pushing. Mm-hmm. Well, he doesn't become president. He becomes vice president, then later president. Mm-hmm. And he starts pushing all of these things into law, and he sets aside all those lands that we have today as public land because he could see the future of wildlife was going to disappear. And without game laws and without the Lacey Act and things like that, you were going to have you're going to have extinctions of some of our most incredible gems in the form of buffalo, elk, antelope, bears.
Do you think bears
cougars,
would be around without that?
So all of these things take place. They all happen around this time, and it shifts from a hunting being viewed as a way of life, like the Pilgrims when they got here, they didn't hunt for sport, to a newer time in our lives where we killed for market hunting, and that has shifted to now we hunt for sport. Like it says in the book, that's where we get this idea of restraint and stewardship and the conservation movement, as well as the political will to place limits on hunting and create wildlife preserves and national parks. All of this is happening. Theodore Roosevelt is in the dead center of it as the president of the United States. The growth of the sport's popularity, its emergence as a subject in the arts and literature, painting, and commercial applications such as furniture carvings and wallpaper design, and the channeling of hunting's energies into a moral, genial capturing of the West through photography, paleontology, and conservation belong to an eventful historical process. Yet, hunting has largely been neglected as a topic of historical inquiry in America. This may reflect the reduced participation in the sport over the last half-century and its abandonment by elites, as well as evolving views of nature and people's changing values regarding diet, animal ethics, the use of firearms, and what constitutes as recreation. Such cultural shifts allow what I call the age of fair chase, the decades between the post-Civil War era and the Eisenhower 1950s, in which sport hunting was a widely accepted pastime and family tradition to more readily come into focus. He's just talking about how it's a little different today. But you know what else has declined are Westerns. Western films aren't as mainstream today as they used to be. There's a major decline in Westerns. It used to be everything was a Western. Mm-hmm. Now we have a lot more science fiction, a lot more Avengers and comic book stuff. And there's definitely been a cultural shift away from the outdoors and away from hunting. But you also have this underground movement of like what we do and mainstream voices like Joe Rogan who goes out and hunts. I feel like hunting TV didn't do us any favors.
No.
Because some of it felt a lot like that early story that we read on the bears. That was kind of hunting TV in a sense.
That was that whack 'em and stack 'em.
And now that that's sort of shifted away, you have other voices coming forward like Meat Eater, describing and teaching people how to hunt and reconnect with the outdoors and why it's meaningful. So I think you have a renaissance going on right now with hunting.
Not only that, but health-wise, people are concerned where their food comes from.
Yeah, I got to admit, like if America didn't just decimate the food supply with chemicals and poor FDA regulations and people trying to make money, we wouldn't have had such a push for hunting. But people are disturbed by what Americans do to their food in mass production. There is a desire to go out and hunt just to be healthy. So I'll read this last bit. This is the last bit to introduce this book. He says, this book introduces many of that story's leading protagonists and relates how they and the animals they pursued came to influence American society and imagination. It asks why the sport was promoted so assiduously and taken up by so many people, why it clicks so readily with journalists, artists, scientists, and clergy. It explores the ways hunting informed advances in weapons design and the natural sciences, and tells the parallel story of the growth of animal protection societies and changing public attitudes regarding extinction, evolution, and what historian William Cronin calls the autonomy of non-human nature. Finally, it examines hunting's links to notions of manhood and self-reliance, while also weighing present-day cultural beliefs regarding guns and animal rights. It's a very political book. What I think is true, though, what I think is a good exercise is understanding how the hunting ethic came into existence and how the sportsman ethic grew so that it was everyone in America had a gun and wanted to go hunt. And it was kind of it was looked to as a very healthy and valuable exercise. It was the thing to do. It was cool. It was
not just that. It's
when you watch
American.
When you watch man's favorite sport, you'll see like hunting was a macho thing. It was a rewarding thing. And you see wallpaper and decorations. You look at old 50s movies and 60s. There's an attitude toward hunting that is masculine and cool.
I love black and white trophy photos.
Yeah.
You have that guy who's got this stick bow, wrists crossed over on top of the bow, leaning up on this like 4,000-pound grizzly bear, smoking a cigarette, his buddy squatting down next to him with a tin cup full of hot coffee, and you can see the steam rising out of it. And they're like wearing loafers and like jeans and like...
Yeah, and there's a 1950 Studebaker parked behind them. You know, it's like... No, I think it's a good exercise to understand how the culture was then. And as he says, you have things that kind of grow in our society, like anti-hunting groups that come up alongside of hunting, and how it's kind of changed. It's going to be a useful exercise to go through the book. The book says, America's love affair with sport hunting led to enhanced appreciation of the great outdoors and to public acceptance of the need for management of wildlife populations in wilderness. But it also contributed to the wholesale slaughter of birds and animal species and nourished the myth that hunters' dominance over living prey prepared them uniquely to be also conquerors of other men. We are a nation of hunters and frequenters of forest, plains, and waters, President Theodore Roosevelt once declared. No form of labor is harder than the chase, and none is so fascinating or so excellent as a training school for war. Some hunter conservationists, most notably Boone and Crockett Club member Madison Grant, extended their nature stewardship to irresponsible pseudoscientific speculation about the alleged inferiority of racial and ethnic categories. So he's basically saying, that it led to an appreciation of the great outdoors, public acceptance of the need for management and wildlife population in wilderness, but it also contributed to the wholesale slaughter of birds and animal species that nourished the myth that hunters' dominance. I don't know if that's really fair. I don't know if that's really fair, because and we'll see what he uncovers, but I don't think it's fair to say that this hunting ethic contributed to the slaughter of birds and animal species and nourished the myth that hunters being dominant over their prey made them conquerors of other men. I've never I mean, Theodore Roosevelt is just saying that there's no form of labor that is harder than the chase, and none is so fascinating or excellent as the training school for war. I think saying that hunting makes you in touch with nature, makes you tougher, and that it's one of the hardest things you can go and do. I don't think that is the same thing as saying that you should wholesale slaughter birds and animal species. In fact, I think that's antithesis to the hunting sport ethic. If there were over harvesting being done, well, that was due to game laws and biologists that weren't doing a good job being stewards over the resource. They set the rules, they and then the hunters follow those game laws. I don't really think it's fair to say that. I'd be curious to see how the book proves such a thing, because when you have the game laws come into place, you don't have the wholesale slaughter of animals. You actually have the restoration. You have ducks on the brink of extinction. You have buffalo and all these other things. As soon as you bring the hunting ethic into place, you have them all bounce back. So how can you say it's the wholesale slaughter? The wholesale slaughter happened prior to this, when we were dealing with not hunting as a sport, but you were dealing with hunting as a means of income, because you were market hunting. You were killing birds by the dozen so you could sell their feathers. Had nothing to do
with meat or protein.
Nothing to do with an ethic or a challenge or connecting with the outdoors. It had everything to do with just killing as many as possible to make money.
It's different. Very different.
I feel like he just conflated this, or you're throwing the anti-hunter a bone that they don't get to have. You don't get to say America's love affair with sport hunting led to enhanced appreciation of great outdoors and to public acceptance of the need for management of wildlife population, but also contributed to the wholesale slaughter of birds and animal species. BS. What wholesale slaughter? As soon as we had that ethic in place, we stopped killing animals as he just described. But let's see where the book goes, because perhaps I'm wrong. My approach has been to not only look back, but to see where this historically beloved form of recreation has brought us. And his question is, does the legacy of hunting have anything to say about current wildlife issues? I think it's kind of a no-brainer. Of course it does. But how is a good question to answer. What of the hunter himself? Has his sport been made an anachronism, replaced by newer forms of outdoor recreation? How did the respected weekend sportsman of half a century ago become the reviled trophy hunter of today? And if hunting has moved from mainstream to marginal, what can be said of its devotees, the approximately 4 to 6% of Americans who are licensed hunters, as well as the upward of 70% of non-hunters who say they approve of it as a legitimate, he says, sport, I think, way of life? Ultimately, can we ever fully understand our nation's character if we do not begin to recognize the indelible mark left upon it by our love of the hunt? The Fair Chase will explore possible answers as it relates to the story of the country's most enduring romance. There you have it, Brent.
The enduring romance.
So I'm not going to give away the book. We're going to go through it, but I think that it's a good exercise as we simultaneously go through Theodore Roosevelt's life and what he does. These two things go hand in hand. This is a look back in terms of, this is a good exercise because the author's a skeptic, and he's trying to look at it from an unbiased point of view. And there's a lot to unpack there, a lot to talk about. So what'd you think?
I'm not sure I'm 100% on board with the author on everything. Just from some of the things that he said, there were some trigger words, I suppose. When he's talking,
he's got to sell a book, Brent.
He's got to sell a book, but I mean, when you throw out words like social justice, I automatically take a step back from anything else you're ever going to say for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
I remember being on a date with a girl, and she said the words cultural appropriation, and this was 4 years ago, and that wasn't a huge common topic like it is nowadays. Mm-hmm. And when she said it, it was definitely a trigger word for me to step back.
Red flag.
Red flag. And so I
feminist.
a little bit, yeah. But I'm interested to see what his conclusion in this book is going to be.
Well, I think it's interesting. It's a good exercise because hunting has changed. Understanding why it was so, what happened in America that made it so beloved at one point and then so vilified at another. It's a good exercise to unpack all that, and I think to give a fair look at both sides of the story, right? What has hunting done for America? What has it negatively done?
Well, I would argue without hunting, could America be?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting. What would America be if you didn't have it? You know,
I mean,
yeah.
Not just the concept of America, but the westward expansion, any kind of settling anywhere. I feel without the supplementation of hunting, just never would have happened.
Absolutely. Well, I think that he has made a good case for understanding that hunting is in our DNA. I think he continues to go down that road and unpacks that. I think he talks about how reconnecting with nature, how important it is, how that is so fulfilling. I think that's true as well. And he unpacks that. It'll be interesting to see. We're in a world that's fast changing. So the way people saw things in 2016 to the way they see things in 2020, it's different already. Things change so fast in our world today. It'll be interesting to see how this book came out in May 2018. So I don't know how long it was written before that, but even in a couple of short years, things can change very quickly. People's attitudes can change very quickly. You started to see Joe Rogan hunting not too long ago, and now you see a real cultural shift. You look at what Meat Eater has done. Meat Eater was always out there. Once it went to Netflix, then it blew up. It became mainstream, and people who had never really seen it before or given it a look were finally looking and seeing that hunting is more than what you typically see in your Whitetail Diaries type of hunt.
Yeah.
So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast. I hope it got you thinking. I hope it's a bit of history for you to mull on until next time.
Have you ever heard of a knob kiri?
No.
Or a rungo throwing stick?
Yeah, I think so.
So in Africa, they have these, kind of hard to explain, but it's basically a stick with a ball at the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
And they're made out of a certain kind of tree, and they're a certain kind of shape. It's not like the ball is off center.
Mm-hmm.
And so it almost looks like a deformed candy cane.
Okay.
And they use these things for hunting.
Yeah.
So I have some friends from Africa who one of them served a mission down there for 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
Someone killed a giant cat with this stick and then gave him the stick as a gift, this rungo throwing stick. So this guy brained a leopard at 20 paces with this thing. Well, this guy is also a professional rungo player. I hope I'm saying that right.
Folks, I can't make this
Rungu.
stuff up. Brent is a walking encyclopedia of useless, weird knowledge. Go ahead.
So these sticks that they have, these rungu sticks, or knob kiri, which is basically Zulu for knob stick.
Okay.
So there's a stick with a knob at the end of it.
A club. It's called a club, Brent.
It's kind of like a club, but it's the wrong. They are like a club.
Okay.
They actually used them in World War I. In trench warfare, they were clubbing people with them.
Nice.
Yes, they're very versatile.
Do you have one of these now? Is that what you're telling me?
I do not have one of these. I've seen them in person. They're pretty cool. But it's now a sport.
Right.
So we were talking about how,
you take hunting and you make it into a sport.
So these guys, these Africans, this is one of the oldest forms
It's like
of hunting.
archery.
Yeah.
Archery's a sport.
Yeah,
There's Olympic competitions for it. But it was hunting.
It was hunting. And so you have, it's funny because I was just looking it up on Wikipedia and stuff, trying to find it. And there's a picture of Obama holding one of these next to some tribal African guy. It's a legit sport that people play now.
Yeah. Support us by going out there and subscribing to the newsletter. Support us by using the code GRITTY at Mountain Ops to save. If you got some orders and products you want to get at Mountain Ops, get yourself some trekking poles. We got these sissy sticks, which I can't say enough about these. I think you're going to spend over $200 for an equivalent pair at REI that are both carbon and aluminum. Ryan Lampers and I put these to the test. These things are incredible, and they're going to cost you, with our discount, like $100.
I think it's
$115 or something.
About.
So that helps us out. And so do that. And also use the code GRITTY at Seek Outside. Save 5% on shelters and on all the lightweight stoves, titanium stoves for your later season hunts. Even September. I like using them in September. And use the code GRITTY for your backcountry meals with Heather's Choice. And you save 15% off there. And for you archers out there, use the code GRITTY for Valkyrie broadheads. Get yourself some Jagger or Blood Eagle broadheads. And do us a favor and stay gritty.